Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the show. I have with me Dr. Nirmal, and he is a historian of late antiquity and the Middle Ages, and also the High Middle Ages, and Renaissance as well.
Yes.
And so, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Basically, what I'm interested in when I'm looking at these various fields of study is to look at those ideas that are not only important in the past, but those ideas that have come through to us in the present, which are very important for us to understand how we are to live and what are we supposed to do. I think these two questions determine so much of what it is that we are concerned with in this day and age. And we try to answer these two questions in so many ways. And that's where history, in all of its various stages, can help us.
Right. So the theme of today's discussion will be humanism and the humanities. This is something that both you and I are very interested in. Humanism is a long developing idea that took, thousands of years to develop. And we would sort of like to explore maybe a big history of the ideas behind humanism. So the plan is to go way back in time into the distant past, the Indo-European past, and maybe start there and work our way forward in a sort of genealogy of morals, if you will.
Sure. That is an interesting way to begin the discussion of humanism, because what humanism shows us is that there always has been a consistent concern with how it is that we are supposed to treat each other and live with each other. And the earliest manifestation, that's interesting, you mentioned the Indo-Europeans, the earliest manifestation that we have of this kind of behavior, which has consistently yielded results, is that Indo-European concept of the warrior band, the Männerbund, they call it in German. And this warrior band had specific codes by which they lived. And these codes, to me, suggest that we are talking about a very early, I don't want to use primitive, but a very early form of humanistic thinking. Because the warrior band, the Männerbund, concerned itself with developing the world around them in such a way that it allowed for an easy and effortless manipulation of that world, by which we mean that the world was malleable. The world is not a supernatural given that cannot be tinkered with. So this idea that things are malleable, we first see in this very early manifestation of the warrior band, or the Männerbund. Why I say that, or why we think we should look at this, is that the Männerbund, the warrior band, saw itself as a community, first of all. Secondly, a community that thought alike, that considered itself like-minded. And thirdly, this like-mindedness was, of course, based upon ideas, and then that these ideas had consequences in the real world. So, what is that basic concept that the Männerbund, or the warrior band, had? Well, that is usually known as the heroic, that which makes a man, or that which makes a human being effective in life. And that concept of being effective in life is one of the earliest manifestations of humanity seeking to change the world through ideas, through the way ideas handle and manipulate reality. So we can go back to that distant past, and of course, these are, as with a lot of the Indo-European concepts, these are linguistic concepts, and therefore they do have a very traceable history back to the Bronze Age. And this traceable history, because of the language and through the language, helps us to determine the mindscape, the world of ideas in which these people lived. And this habitation, I should say, of this world, of this mindscape, helps us understand how it is that we encounter the world, where we encounter it in such a way that it's about change. We want to do something about it rather than let it do something to us.
Right. This makes me think of the concept of virtus.
Exactly.
I mean, in the Indo-European past, this is more a sense of manliness or masculinity, or, wanting to effect change in the world. And this grew over time to become a more kind of congealed idea based around masculinity strictly, and not so much kind of that warrior ethic or the warrior spirit. And something could be said even about market economy versus gift exchange economy. The Mannerbund was the way in which the gift economy thrived, where you would essentially build mana by offering gifts, and you would build your retinue by offering larger and larger gifts, horses, land, weapons. And this is how the pre-market or economy operated before things had ascribed specific values in a numerical sense. And this wouldn't happen until the Middle Ages, but the market economy, the gift economy, it's almost like a dialectic that it comes and goes with civilization. So I think these play into this whole dynamic.
For sure. And if we look at, staying on track with the Indo-European concepts, if we look at the word hero, that word is related to virtue, veros, in I guess Homeric Greek, and this idea of the hero is someone who possesses particular virtues. These virtues can, of course, be manly or heroic or warrior-like, but they can also be those virtues which are moral, because part of being a hero, part of being what a human being is supposed to be, is that concept of the best expression of humanity comes through moral structures. And these moral structures are what is involved in understanding what one is supposed to do. And this is going to get picked up later on in Greek philosophy, this whole idea that we need to continually be concerned with moral action. So heroism then is really moral action. And that we can, of course, as well historically trace through various times and cultures.
So when would we see a major change from that mode of heroism toward the birth of the individual? This is a very slow and gradual process. It unfurls over maybe 1,000 years or so. Let's say at the peak of Kleos culture in Homeric times down to 1st century AD, where we get rampant superstition, metropolitan living, world travel, these sorts of things. These ideas tend to disintegrate, but they still remain to some extent. So how prevalent was heroism even in the age of the individual? Was this still a value that people wanted, or did it become stratified in accordance with classes and things like this? The people who had the ability to be heroic became heroic, and those who did not, did not.
Yes, that's a very interesting concept, looking at how heroism then gets subsumed by market forces, let's say. When we look at this concept of heroism devolving or evolving into something else, let's take a look at the word Lord itself in English. if we go back to Beowulf and Old English, Anglo-Saxon, the word is hlaford. And hlaford is someone who possesses loaves of bread. So a hlaford is someone who dishes out the bread, who hands out the bread to his warriors. So that concept is still prevalent well into the Anglo-Saxon age. So, for example, when Bede is talking about a lord, that word is being used again, and there is a distant echo of that heroism still. But that concept of gift-giving, that concept of interacting with others through a system of reciprocity, tends to get devalued or perhaps even disappears. But I would prefer devalued because we can argue whether it disappears or not. Sometime around, I would suggest, 12th century or so. Why I place it at that period of time is because at that particular instance, or during that time period, the 12th century, some very important things begin to happen in Europe. And one of those is this concept of chivalry, for lack of a better term. This chivalrous behavior replaces the heroic behavior. And this idea then of chivalry as superseding heroic morality is something that we notice not simply in literature, but also in modes of personal behavior. And we can see this happening in the modes of personal behavior in things like how battle is supposed to be fought, how individuals are supposed to behave with each other, how men and women interact with each other. There are different codes replacing, and of course these codes are firmly grounded, these newer codes are firmly grounded in the Hebrew Christian tradition. And we can get into the background of those as well, but the Hebrew Christian tradition determines, or perhaps I should say oversees, the replacement of the Indo-European heroic concepts with these chivalric modes.
Right. I think something that probably should be said is that to the ancient Greek mind, let's say to the Homeric hero, one's kleos is physically manifest in their goods. So pots and pans and bronze armor and shields and weapons, these are all outward manifestations of someone's glory. And chivalry, like you said, this doesn't go away entirely, but there is kind of an upward ascent where the concept of heroism gets sucked up into idealism. And it becomes an abstract thing. Things like questing for the Grail or getting the white hand of the lady. And these are all ideologically charged heroic pursuits. They're not necessarily just getting the nicest pot or, sulking in your tent because Agamemnon took away your woman. Yeah. There's, the knight of chivalry doesn't even have his own woman. He looks up to somebody else's woman. So these are developments that are inextricably intertwined with Judeo-Christian thought systems that kind of had no place within Indo-European culture until very late.
Yes, but also I would suggest that perhaps there is a deep link with the Hebrew Christian culture, because what it does is that, and this is, I think, the grandeur and the strength of the Hebrew Christian culture is that it understands that certain ideas are essential, and it doesn't jettison them. Rather, what it does is that it takes them and uses them. So heroism becomes something else. For example, in Anglo-Saxon poetry, which is one of the last Anglo-Saxon history, I should say, is one, Anglo-Saxon culture, is the last heroic culture really that we know of. The Vikings aren't really in that mode, so we can't get into them. But the Anglo-Saxons do. And we can see this transitioning where the hero becomes Christ. he is the heroic figure. How he handles his life on earth, how he handles his ministry, and then how he handles his heroic death. And if you look at the words used and the sentiment employed, that is a very ancient sentiment, and basically the vocabulary being used. This is the hero. Mm-hmm. These are the medieval Germanic Heliant traditions. So they don't simply disappear. I think they become, perhaps you can say they develop, because they had reached their epic point very early in ancient history, and they needed to go somewhere else then. You couldn't just be, member of the Menabont anymore. You had to be something else. You had to develop into something else. And I think this is where Christianity has its strength. It allows for the development of these very important ideas into the next stage. It's not simply getting rid of them or something and saying this is no good, this is better. Rather, what we're really talking about is a very profound process where ideas, like human beings, need to develop, and they need certain kinds of channels that will allow them to develop. And without those channels, they can't develop. Mm-hmm. They will always remain, for lack of a better term, infantile. And that, I think, is what we are looking at. And this is the strength of how Christianity historically has handled these ideas that are not really essential to it, but they become essential to it. I think that is the interesting give and take in history that we need to pay more attention to as we look at these ideas.
Right. So how would we say then that, I would say that the humanities precede humanism, and how, if we could maybe do a quick history of the humanities, how might we start with that, and where would we position the origins of this thing? We talked a lot about this actually in my series. I talk a lot about the trivium and the quadrivium, and that, grammar, logic, rhetoric, the foundation, and then the quadrivium are kind of the fulfillment. And there's a special order that you need to do these in. If you mess up the order, you're probably going to confuse yourself. Because you can't study astronomy without arithmetic, and you can't study music without proportions and these sorts of things. So the humanities we would have to put into the Greco-Roman tradition squarely. Would we say that there's an antecedent before that, or would that be some kind of retro-projection?
I think that would be, we would be guilty of retroprojection. When we're talking about the humanities, and we need to eventually, I guess, link them up with humanism as well. But when we're talking about this whole structure of ideas, and why I call them a structure is because what these ideas are suggesting is that man or human beings are not simply biomass that just exist, and the gods can do what they like with us. Rather, what this is suggesting is that the earth is a given, but we need to transform it into the world. And that process of transformation into the world is that idea that the world needs to be made usable to humanity. For example, I always say this, you may be a millionaire, but if you're lost in a forest with $1 million, you're not going to be good for much. You can only use that concept of money within the world. This is how the concept of humanities has affected us and still is important to us, because it has helped us transform the world into something that is human, that is usable.
Right. I think probably since we're going to be talking about humanism in some detail, we would be best to define our terms. So how would you... I've never really pinpointed a definition of humanism. I can say how it came about, but the way I conceive of it is humanism is the idea that humans are the nexus between the material and the intellectual worlds. And you can extrapolate that to the clay and the God, and that mankind is the mediator between the two. We need to think about the great chain of being, because evolution withers away at this concept. The great chain of being, however, situated mankind at the center of the cosmos as the rational animal. And evolution does this as well, but it was not evolution which came up with this idea. So it's funny that a faulty vision of how the universe is created an idea that gives mankind dignity, that he would carry on into the scientific revolution and potentially not lose his soul in the process.
Yes, I think what we're then looking at, if getting back to definitions, if we are to give a working definition to what is humanism, I would suggest that we go back to Bruno Snell's very important work.
We covered this in some detail in the podcast called The Discovery of the Mind, based after the book that he wrote. So we've gone through this.
Excellent.
So some of us are primed, which is good.
Excellent. So I would suggest then that what we are looking at when we're looking at humanism is this understanding that the brain is more than what it is between or inside the skull. The brain is the mind. And this attempt at understanding what this thing is that so profoundly transforms not only individuals, but many individuals and the world around us, and now, of course, the world beyond us, into space and so forth. Because everywhere we look, of course, and this is becoming now, us becoming highly Platonic, everywhere we look, we see or we encounter ideas. Human beings cannot live without ideas. Now, here we have to be very careful, because, as Bruno Snell suggests, that the discovery of the mind is only available to the Greeks. It's the Greeks that discover the mind. And he's very clear and precise about that.
Right. I should stop you there, because I've said this hypothesis and I get assaulted by people who say, oh, well, what about India? So maybe we could talk about that.
For sure. I was just going to get to that.
Yes.
Because what we then have to understand is that when we are talking about the mind, according to Bruno Snell, and it's only available to the Greeks, hence the discovery of the mind, what we're really talking about is a particular understanding of what reality is. So when he says this, the mind, when Bruno Snell says that the mind is only available to the Greeks, i.e. the Greeks discover it, and no one else had it, not the Egyptians, not the Indians, not the Chinese, etc., any of the ancient cultures, what he's saying is that none of these ancient cultures were able to project the mind outside their own particular world. For the Chinese, there was no world outside of China. For the Indians, it was forbidden to cross the oceans. It's a sin. For the ancient Mesopotamians, for the Egyptians, and so forth, these are extremely inward-looking cultures. And so when Bruno Snell is talking about the mind, he's talking about this habit that we have that we are not aware of anymore. It's a very humanistic habit, this habit of always projecting outside of ourselves. And this is part of this problem that we're having, and we can get into this some other time, this clash of cultures problem that people keep talking about. Because ideas, of course, create humanity. And when Snell says that the Greeks discover the mind, he's saying that the Greeks gave us a particular habit of thinking which says, project outside of yourself. if you are not able to project outside of yourself, you are an incomplete human being.
Yes. You are an idiot, a private man.
Yes.
Someone
Exactly.
who does not try to shape the world.
Exactly. I did not want to say that word, but exactly. That's exactly what you become. You become mindless. And by being mindless, you are only driven by passions, because you are only concerned with getting ahead in life for yourself. This is why historically cultures, ancient cultures and modern day ones, could practice all kinds of things that we object to. And we have to ask ourselves, why do we object to them, and why don't they object to them? And this is what Bruno Snell says, that it's all about the discovery of the mind. If you can project outside of yourself, you create this concept of empathy. You understand that what I do can hurt someone else, and therefore it can hurt me. A mind that doesn't understand how to project outside of itself tends not to understand that concept of hurt outside the self. And I think this is the important thing that humanism delves into. This is what humanism is all about. Yes, people misuse it, I should say, or even misrepresent it as some sort of, man is the measure of all things kind of thing. But what does that mean? What does that mean? It doesn't mean that man becomes a god and he creates his world and all that sort of thing. No, rather what that means is that the mind understands more than the self. And the mind is greater than the self. Why? Because the mind continually participates in the world of ideas. And the world of ideas always is greater than the individual, because that world endures. You and I come and will go. But the ideas we're talking about, people will still continue to talk about them.
Right, insofar as there are people to continue the ideas.
For sure.
And that is the epiphenomenalism of the ideological world. They interpenetrate one another. And that's something that on this series we're very cautious not to fall into the pit of dualism, and also, especially on this subject, and the pit of also radical monism, to the point where there is no distinction whatsoever between the gray matter and the mind. Well, it's like evidently there is something going on, but they are, the hard problem of consciousness is a problem of language, not an actual problem. There are no paradoxes in nature, and so they're all reconciled out in that real world. So humanism, then, where would we say that it begins? With Petrarch, or would we say that it has inklings that go back to Cicero before that, or that the Greeks and the Romans had some sort of proto-humanism and it was revived? Where should we start talking about it concretely?
I think the proper place to locate it historically is within the Carolingian context. And it's with Charlemagne and his court and the various people that he brings into his court, the culture that he creates. That is the true foundation of humanism as we understand it. Why I say that is because that civilization, the Carolingian civilization, is the very first manifestation of this idea of projection outside the self, where ideas are important no matter where they are to be found. Ideas are not ethnic possessions that only belong to that group of people and therefore are no good to others.
Right.
And that, I think, is that habit of mind, that way of thinking, should properly be located in the Carolingian world and that grand culture it creates. And not simply artifacts, of course, but ideas. And those ideas that come out of that culture, I think, are the true starting point of the humanistic outlook.
That's funny that you say it's Charlemagne. I mean, an illiterate was the man who spawned the love of letters that would spawn humanism. So out from the Carolingian time, we have we have Vikings raiding in the north, we have Magyars raiding in the east, and we have Muslims raiding in the south. And so we have this sort of crucible of pressure building up, and Europeans are coalescing into tighter and tighter groups. They had been scattered about after the collapse of the Roman Empire, after the marauding Visigoths and Goths and Vandals were tearing everything apart. And so Charlemagne was one of these strongmen who decided that he would apply his mind and project his ideas outward. He founded, you could say, the education system that we use today in some sense. You could say the Lyceum or the Academy is really the birthplace, and then the Madrasa carries some of those elements. But following the Carolingian period, we get Vikings start getting tamed. The outward projection of Charlemagne starts to work, and it pacifies people, which that's a double-edged sword, because you kill all the old gods and you strip certain people of their meaning, but you introduce new forms of society, and Christianity is definitely one of these things. The market economy is also another one of these things. And with time, we get wealth again. We get surplus of energy for people to actually sit around and study. And this largely takes places in the monasteries in Europe during the Middle Ages, but over the centuries, it breaks out of the monasteries, and we get people like Dante, like Petrarch, and we've been talking about Dante actually quite a bit recently. Maybe we could talk about Dante a little bit and his contribution. So what would we say Dante's main contribution, let's say outside of writing in Italian, because that was the big thing, was we're not going to use this language that nobody speaks, nobody understands. We're going to start using the local languages because they have value. It isn't that the Latin world or the everything in Latin is sacred and holy, and that's passed on from on high, and that Italian or French or German are somehow corrupt and need to be ignored. So we have people finally starting to write in Italian again. And Dante is one of the first people to do this, and Petrarch as well. Do you have anything to say about these individuals?
Sure. When we're looking at, or when we move on to the time of Dante, and the dawn of the Italian or the Florentine Renaissance, what we're really getting at is a summation of something important that has happened already, and this is usually referred to as the 12th century Renaissance. This is, Peter Abelard and company, where there has been a struggle, a fight to understand what thinking and faith are all about. And here I think we need to understand something I think very essential, and that component in contemporary discussion usually gets left out or is ignored. And this is the idea that there is, in the human mind, when it projects outside of itself, a desire or a need to look for something greater and higher. And this need to look for something greater and higher is often codified as God.
Logos.
The Logos, exactly. And once this codification happens, there are certain rules and ideas introduced to explain what that is. So in the 12th century Renaissance, which is, I think, the proper location of Dante and his ideas, and then, of course, the Florentine and the Italian Renaissance, what we're really getting at is a very clear understanding of what reality is and what humanity's role in reality is. And that role is something that is defined once again by way of the ancients, namely Plato and Aristotle. And that concept then of the self, or that habit of mind, I should say, of referring back to ancient authority, referring back to the past, creates a very interesting and I think important system, methodology, where we always like to place the mind within the context of history. And that idea of placing the individual, I guess, in a broader context is the true force or the true magic of humanism, in that it takes the human being, the particular human being who is limited, and puts him in a broader, grander structure. And that ability of placing the individual into a grand structure, something bigger than the self, is, I think, the greatest offering that humanism has given us.
Right. And that is something that I've been trying to do with this series, is build a cosmology, a complete, not complete, but a thorough picture of the world, of the whole world, that is worth living in and that is worth fighting for. That is not just, epiphenomenal clouds floating over our field of vision and it'll all be gone and that'll be that. There is something there, and something that needs to be wrestled with. Well, then, going off this idea, why then do you think that Virgil was Dante's guide?
That, I think, is first and foremost that humanistic habit of mind of placing the self in a grander structure. So Dante, for sure, is saying, not that I'm Virgil, but he's saying that Virgil, of course, is the grand structure.
Right. I am a poet. He is the poet.
The poet, exactly.
But not a Christian.
But he could be.
Yes, but can't get to heaven.
There's always purgatory.
Yeah.
But I think what this does is that, and this brings us back to our discussion of, or our thinking about Dante, is that it helps us understand that why Dante chooses Virgil, or what Dante is all about. One of the things that he's all about, we can't summarize him, but one of the things that he's all about is this idea that there are certain processes, certain gradations of knowledge, let's say, certain paths or ways that are available to us to access that which is beyond us, that which we should call truth. So this whole business of going through these various levels of, entertaining as they are, hell and so forth, and then heaven later on, what Dante is trying to do is, as you suggest, build a cosmology, not simply a cosmology of faith, but more importantly, I think, a cosmology of the mind, or perhaps even the cosmology of the soul, because that process that allows us to mature into something greater than what we are as individuals. And this maturation can only happen through ideas. It isn't, achieved by eating a lot or weightlifting or so forth. Sure, that is fun and it's something we may enjoy doing, but that is not how we become greater than who we are. We can only become greater than who we are is by maturing our ideas, by following the process, the channels that lead us from a dark wood into glory. And that's where Dante ends up. It's interesting that if we place, if we think about this whole process of Dante, we get into this whole idea of allegory. What are allegories? What are parables? What do they do? Yes, they're entertaining short stories and so forth, but what's it all about? And allegories, of course, are these processes that take a simplistic concept and transform it into something bigger, greater. This is alchemy, right? Mm-hmm. This is what this is, that pure, noble state that we need to reach. So Dante is an alchemist of the soul. That's what he's doing. He's putting it in a crucible, transforming it,
right,
and it becomes something.
I mean, the dark wood is his crucible, we would say.
It is.
It's the dark night of the soul, right?
It's the world.
Yeah. And I think something that is interesting in Dante is that he gives us a vision of consequence, that our actions have consequences and that they are actually quite specific. They aren't nebulous. It's not like, oh, you do something bad, you wind up in hell. It's like, no, you do something bad and specifically based on that action, you wind up in a hell of your own creation. And I think that is much like the world. The world is a pretty unforgiving place if you are willy-nilly about it. And you can very quickly create a hell for yourself in whatever it is, greed or sloth or gluttony. And so this acts as a wonderful metaphor, whether or not you believe that the moment you die, you will be taken either to heaven or to hell or purgatory. It's a transcendent poem, but it has imminent implications.
For sure. And I think what it also then tells us, picking up on your point, is that what we are then looking at is that when human beings are forever self-contained, they cannot get outside of themselves, that's when the hells are created, the various particular personal hells that we create. And we call these through various, we call these psychological problems and whatnot. But they are this inability to transcend the self. And when we cannot transcend the self, when we are inhibited by various ways, often by our own creations or by external factors or whatever, but when this inability comes about, that's when the hell comes about.
Right.
Because human beings, because they're humanistic, because of the way we've been now habituated to think, need to go beyond themselves perpetually, always.
Right.
The world of ideas is what makes us humans, and once we are denied that world, that we enter into hell.
Right. Yes, and I mean this is where the hardline materialist point of view can take us if we tote that line too hard. Well, speaking of the self, maybe this might be a good opportunity to say, well, what about those systems that don't have a self, like the dialogues of Melinda, which we've discussed on this show. This was during the time that Alexander went to India. He set up a whole bunch of colonies along the way, or city-states, let's say. One of these was Bactria, and this was a great place of intellectual ferment between the Hellenistic West and the, let's say, Buddhist. I wouldn't say all Buddhist, but certainly in Bactria there was a Buddhist presence. And now, in these dialogues, we say that the body, or rather the individual, is like a chariot. If you take away its wheels, it is no longer a chariot. If you take away the reins or the horse or the axle or any of these parts, it is no longer a chariot. And much like that, the Buddhist conceives of the individual who is selfless in and of itself, but it's as if the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. How do we recognize or reconcile this vision of the world with the Western insistence on the self, this divine spark at the soul of people that lives on after death, and it accumulates all sorts of baggage throughout the life of the individual? What do we do about these things?
If we're talking about the dialogues of Melinda, or those things written by Menander, who was one of the Greek kings of the Punjab, what we are looking at is a very interesting and I think important amalgamation of the East and the West. And what we're really talking about, I guess, is how Greek thinking, the paideia, enters into the consciousness of the world outside of Greece. Remember, this is the strength of Hellenism, that it projects outward. It isn't just for the Greeks. Isocrates, anyone who thinks like a Greek is a Greek. Ideas, what makes us human beings. This is our great affinity. If we think alike, we are a group. This, unfortunately, in recent history becomes misused as DNA or genes and so forth, and then gets projected out as racism and whatnot. What we're really talking about at the heart of it is this idea or this understanding that what unites us is the commonality of ideas. And that is what Hellenism does in the East. Unfortunately, we don't know too much about what was in the East before the Greeks showed up. It is, it's a topic we can perhaps get into later, but because it's a very interesting one. Where is that, the topic being, where does the Greeks stop and the East begin? Mm-hmm. We don't really know. So Menander, writing about Buddhism, is he writing purely about Buddhism, or is this also Greek philosophy that he's writing about, or what context is that?
It's this Stoicism.
Exactly.
And then obviously we have to ask ourselves, because we're so far in the future, is this Hermann Hesse, or is this some sort of Victorian reconstruction from scholars who say we're in India during the British Raj and these sorts of things? So these are layers that have to be peeled back as well.
For sure, because that is one of the problems, because when we project our structures back onto the past, we have a serious problem, and we then start to construct the past rather than allow it to tell us a little bit about itself. And this is the problem with so much of the faith systems of the East, is that we, despite tons written on them, we know very little about their early history and their history proper, because a lot of what we know has been through the anthropological endeavors of the British in the East. Valiant and great as these efforts were in codifying and recording a lot of this stuff that would have disappeared perhaps otherwise, what it does do is that it then creates a methodology that the native populations then pick up and use. And these native populations, of course, are trained in Western schools and universities. They use this material and construct matching narratives, matching structures that are equivalent or perhaps compatible, they might say, with Western ones, or perhaps even, say, Christian ones, if we're talking about
right. So
faith.
Like a concrete structure becomes crystallized where there was none, where it was more syncretic and maybe idiosyncratic and animistic and polytheistic and all jumbled up together, and this starts to become systematized as quote-unquote Hinduism.
Exactly. For example, Hinduism doesn't have a word for Hinduism.
That's great.
So this is the problem we get into. And we saw this happening, for example, very clearly, historically, in Sikhism. People, of course, think Sikhism is, guys with beards and turbans on their head. Well, that's because of 1925, when a committee of true, real Sikhs sat down and said, who is a Sikh? And they started defining Sikhism. By doing so, they destroyed all of the varieties of Sikhism that existed. And so you ended up with one type. And what was this type? Well, that type that was codified in the British Army. This is part of their uniform, the turban and the beard and so forth. It has nothing to do. Exactly. These are traditions that are codified as proper to you as a soldier. Whether we can push them back all the way to whatever origins is very problematic, because Sikhism came in a variety of forms. There's at least 11 of them that have completely been they've merged with Hinduism again, because it comes out of that. Because Sikhism basically is monotheistic Hinduism. But because of that 1925 committee, they call themselves, basically codified what a proper Sikh is. And this happened with all of them. So when we go back to the time of Menander and we're looking at Buddhism and so forth, how much of that is actual proper Buddhism and how much of that is 19th century codification of these cultures and religions? We have a very difficult time tearing the two apart, because we don't really know. The earliest proper records we have are often medieval for these
like
texts.
Patanjali and these kinds of things.
Exactly.
So notions like the Parabrahma and the Atman and these very kind of Baroque theosophical ideas, where do these come from?
Here we have to be very careful. Yes, the words occur. Yes, these words are Sanskritic. Yes, the words do occur in the language proper. But do they mean what we think and we say they mean is something else?
Right.
So yes, you have a word. Atman, meaning soul, and probably is related to the German Atma, the breath and so forth. Sure. But is it what we think it is?
Right.
Is it the proper soul and all of its manifestations as we understand it? Or is that projection? Or is that reconstruction according to how we look at it? I often explain this when we're talking about this sort of thing, is that in the 19th century, and perhaps still today, we often, always, even if we're not believers, look at other faith systems through the lens of Christianity. So it doesn't matter if you're a Christian or not. You, as a Western person, are brought up as a Christian.
Especially if you're like Pure Land Buddhist or whatever.
Exactly. And then what we have to do then is how much of that Buddhism is also the same, is also a lens that was brought on to whatever that was back then that Menander wrote about. Whatever that was, and then he codifies it into a proper theology, a proper philosophy as we understand it. Because at the core of Buddhism is materialism. And we have no indication of materialism in that region anytime, in that time period, until the Greeks show up, who have had the materialistic tradition in the pre-Socratics for a long time. And it's traceable and it's knowable. The same cannot be said of that. So whether Buddhism, which is profoundly materialistic, is an independent development in the East, or whether it's transplanted Greek ideas, we can't say. But we do know that the Greek ideas have a history that we can trace, and Buddhism does not, as such.
And there isn't, and this is often how people think, there isn't a single point of contact. There is a constant frame by frame, minute by minute points of contact that are constantly happening. And cultures interpenetrate each other. I mean, I'm sure you have also grown weary of this concept of cultural appropriation, and we don't need to get too much into it, but it's absurd because it assumes that there is some sort of Platonic race in the sky to whom all ideas pertain, and it just isn't that way. Minds are permeable, and ideas are going through these pores back and forth and changing one another.
I think the problem is that we live in an age of confusion, and some have described it, as you know, as an age of darkness or a dark age. What has happened, of course, is that because people have abandoned the mind, abandoned ideas, they've latched on to feelings, and these feelings are all that matter. This is a very pre-Socratic concept in itself, that feelings are greater than ideas. And hence, when we talk about silliness like cultural appropriation and so forth, whether you can wear a hat that belongs to that culture or not, it's just beyond stupidity. But what it is profoundly, and I think this is the sadness of our culture, is that we have become so shallow in our understanding of the world around us, is that we have driven ourselves deep inside our own selves. So when people say this is cultural appropriation, what they're really expressing is a deep and profound selfishness. And that says, this belongs to me, you cannot have it. Now, if this were the case, then the world would be a very poor place, because...
Be very few wheels.
Exactly. Bread would not exist, beer would not exist, etc., etc., etc. We can keep going. Mathematics, so for the writing, because things should only belong to those people that invented them. Well, this is not how humanity works or has ever worked. Cultures are malleable. Cultures are like clothing. You wear what fits. You don't keep wearing the same clothes all your life. You don't. And we demand the same of culture. Well, no. Cultures, like ideas, develop and change, and if they're no good, they're gotten rid of.
Yeah, the body itself switches its cells every 6 years.
Exactly.
So.
Exactly. And so the mind, I think, is simply destroyed when this kind of thinking comes about. So we have to be very careful with ideas, and we have to be very careful not to fall into the trap of selfishness. This is what's going on when we talk about these kinds of things. And of course, it's very trendy and current to say all these things. And that's another topic, because that gets into the political demands that are made of people. And people say these things because they like to belong to groups and whatnot. So, and there's comfort in that for sure, but that's not where ideas and thinking belong. As Nietzsche says, madness is proper to crowds. Individuals on their own are rarely mad.
Which is funny, because that is the opposite position of the Catholic Church, which is that on our own we're all mad, and you need a group of people to keep you from being astray. I think probably Nietzsche was right, and the Catholic Church is wrong, but that's another issue altogether.
That's another matter. Yes, we can get into that some other time.
But, so, yes, then getting back on track with humanism, then, we get the inklings of it with Dante. This is kind of proto-humanism. And would we say that this has something to do with the changing values of what a human being is? Because life is cheap, and I mean, life is cheap in a lot of places, but our entire legal system, our code of ethics, everything that we do in the West hinges on this idea that human beings have some sort of dignity. Even if they are the lowliest of serfs or the most wretched of vagabonds, these all have this divine human spark inside of them, and so need to be treated with dignity and respect. When do we start seeing this shift of values? I for some reason think my mind goes straight to St. Francis and the Franciscan movement, which ties into this move again from the gift economy to the market economy and the poverty that came with it, and the dignity that someone like Francis would extend to people who had none in their current cosmology. Maybe you have something to say about that.
Sure. I think when we're talking about this concept that each individual life has value, that I think is a very important contribution to ideas that comes to us through Christianity, through the teaching of Christ, because it's Christ that first pinpoints that each individual is not simply, a cog in the wheel, which is the ancient concept, even for the Greeks. The individual is not worth much.
Yeah, the polis is the most irreducible unit.
Exactly. And so when Christ comes about, I think there's a profound change in thinking that is instigated. And I think this is part of the success of Christianity in the Roman world and why it does spread so quickly and so efficiently, because it offers something that was missing in the world, which is this idea that human beings, no matter how lowly, no matter how worthless, each individual does have value. Now, what does that mean? What does that simply mean, that it has, a person has value? Is it monetary or is it otherwise? No. And this is, again, the strength of Christianity, is that it says, no, it's not about material value that we're talking about, but each individual has moral worth. What that means, I think, very simply, is that when we're talking about moral worth, we are talking about projection. This is where we began. We're talking about looking at that lowly person as ourselves.
And the potential to change the world.
Exactly. And what we then must do, and this is the heart of charity, is, and this is again a Christian concept, this concept of charity, what we must then do once we project ourselves into that status, that lower status, we must enable or help that person to achieve something greater than where he is at the time, in the sense that suddenly ideas need to be given to this person that help him or her to go beyond the individual status he suddenly has right now.
Right. Or the chaos that he's swamped in. Because often It's a problem of crawling out of chaos by building order. The image goes back to Apollo and Python, or Zeus and Typhon, or all of these. Well, even Christ overcoming Satan. Or St. George and the dragon. These are all narratives of order overcoming chaos. But order has to come from an idealistic place. There is a material order to the world, and I would say Taoism is a great example of trying to work in line with that. But there is something about that has to come from epiphenomenally from the gray matter between your ears to convince you that creating order out of chaos is worth it.
Exactly. And once we're talking about this concept then, of change, I guess is what we're really talking about. What we then get into is a very important concept, again, missing in the Greek ideas, is this notion of progress, that life involves certain kinds of places, stations that we have to visit and be in, and then from there we go into the next station or place, until eventually we come to that place where we all need to be and will end up, which is making sure we have a good death and then thinking about whatever comes after. This entirety of life is something that I think is very particular to Christianity, because that's what it provides the world, which was missing. And that picks up with your concept then of order, because what we're then doing is suggesting something very interesting, I think something rather profound, which is that all moral concepts are ideas. And because they are ideas, these moral concepts have eternal ramifications. So, your good work, your good decision, your effort to be good, be truthful, be honest, and so forth, is not only good for you right now, but it's good for you in eternity. That translation of the self beyond the world, beyond the material, into the vastness of the universe, say, the vastness of the other world or the life beyond, whatever, is, I think, part and parcel of this ability or this habit of placing ourselves outside of ourselves. Now, a lot of cultures, again, do not do this.
It's like contemplation versus meditation.
Exactly.
Or the I-thou relationship in ritual magic versus, say, some sort of ascetic meditative practice. I often warn people against the I-thou construction, which is funny. It has its problems and it has its strengths, and that's kind of where how I approach it, is that it's a double-edged sword. It's sort of like Christianity as well. You give everybody human dignity. Well, what happens when, you go to Ethiopia as a missionary and you start feeding everybody to the point that they have way more children than they would have had, and then there's not enough food on the land to support those people, and then there are mass starvations and die-offs. So it's like, was it a good thing to try to bring order out of chaos when it just created more chaos? So these are the kind of things that I struggle with in terms of finding a balance.
I think how we can approach that sort of thing is that we have to be, well, let's use Occam's razor. And I would suggest that moral decisions never create chaos. So a missionary going to Ethiopia feeding people as a morally good thing to do will never have bad results. Whether there are lots of children and they die off, I think those events, and this is getting us into evil then as well, those things that affect us in a bad way, in an evil way, are really forces of chaos. This is these seems to be the themes that we're circling around here. And when we're talking about evil, we really are talking about particular systems of chaos, because chaos is not chaos.
Yeah, I think of unnecessary pain.
Sure. And even there, I think we have to be very careful, because when we're talking about unnecessary pain, and this is where, we get into...
what is justified. Yeah. Or justifiable.
Exactly. We get into that. And also, we get into this idea or this notion that there's certain kinds of things that lie beyond the control of the individual. And because that is the case, we have to critique morally the political structures that create that chaos, or various kinds of chaos. Again, that gets us into, politics and political science and whatnot, but that's where we need to focus on, because if goodness is intimately related to moral structures, then those moral structures need to be projected outward in all aspects of life.
Right.
And one of the greatest aspects of life from which we always retract morality is politics for some odd reason. We come up with this strange phrase like the separation of church and state. Well, the problem with that is that the state becomes the church. It becomes the receptor and the holder of all morality.
And the state grew out of the church.
Exactly, and dispensers of morality. And that, I think, is a very dangerous power to give over to the state. So we need to think about these things. And I think this is where we then end up if we are to project, move forward, i.e., where does humanism belong? where will it lead us? Does it have a future? Does it still need it? And not to become, instrumental in our arguments, but when we're talking about humanism, I think it's something that is essential. And this is where we need to go back to history again. And that is to say, why is it that at certain times renaissances are created and occur? There's always a cycle. Herodotus is right. History does move in circles. And because it moves in circles, we are always confronted by goodness and chaos, order and chaos, good and evil, etc., etc. And what is it that brings us out of chaos? What will lead us back into goodness? And that is the Renaissance. That is humanism. That is that habit of projecting ideas outside of ourselves, always, because by doing so, we order the world. We create the world, and thereby make sure that that world is good.
And I would think the humanities are the arm of this process. So I think changes in art are probably the most obvious place to go. We go from, medieval tapestry, something like the Bayeux Tapestry, and then we look at Giotto's work, and we see what he's doing is he is looking at the world. He's actually seeing it as it is, as opposed to creating a simulacrum of it and then reproducing that. And I think that is tremendous. It's this insane moment in history where someone looks at something and goes, nobody's actually looked at space before and seen it as it really is. Yeah. And I think that this also occurs in music, and it occurs. There's a constant dialectic between the Baroque sort of will in man to over-complexify things and then to simplify. And that's kind of one of these dialectics that I see at work in history, especially in art and in music. To me, the Baroque period is the highest period of art, and then you get the classical period, which some people consider it an improvement, and I consider it a degeneration because it is a simplification. It's stripping it down. It had become too complex. We need to concentrate on pure forms and balance and this and that, and it's that gets out of control, and it leads to the Romantic period where we have massive orchestras that are untold sizes doing things that had never been done before, and there's this tension at work. And I think that this is kind of to me, this is the Tao at work. And this is also this idea of Renaissance is part of this Tao of a die-off and a resurrection and a die-off and a resurrection. And it's like the crops and the setting of the sun. And it's one of the great mysteries of life, that everything is cyclical. It's just funny that it when it manifests on a small scale, we can see it very clearly, but when it manifests on a huge scale, there's very few people that can see it. And that's probably the more important scale to be looking at the world on. So I would think that the discovery of the New World and we're jumping ahead almost 200 years, but the discovery of the New World and the Reformation would be these two other processes which would just radically alter the way that the West conceives of the world. Maybe you have some thoughts on this process.
Yes. And that, again, with the Reformation, we're looking at a very particular understanding of the humanities and humanism. But what has happened, and the discovery of the New World, what happens with the Reformation, and of course it comes in three versions. Yeah,
it's more popular, I think. I know you know this. Probably listeners don't know this. We don't so much speak of the Reformation and the Renaissance anymore, more so just Reformations and Renaissances.
Good.
And that's a better way to think of it.
Exactly. And when we're talking about these processes, because that's what they really are, I think we are, and I'm going to leave the new discovery of the New World out of this, but just focusing on the Reformations, we are really talking about the diminishing of the world. Why I say that is because the Reformation brings to the world a different kind of order. And this order is one in which the world can only be rational. And anything other than rational is pagan, is magic, is wrong. And this, of course, is intentionally done. It's known as the Black Legend, which is how can we destroy Roman Catholicism? And there's all kinds of strategies being constructed in order to bring that about, because Roman Catholicism is the great evil for the Reformation. So one of the things that it does attack, notice, in the Reformation, one of the things that are attacked, is the entire educational process, or
scholasticism.
Exactly. And the attack on scholasticism has the most profound effects on the world. And I think sadly so. Why? Because within scholasticism, you had a very important coexistence of the various strands, and Remy Bragg describes these really well in his study, Eccentric Culture, which is that these strands are the cultures, philosophy, traditions, and of course beliefs of ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and Jerusalem, by which means, of course, what we commonly refer to as Judeo-Christianity, but which I like to consider as this conglomeration of these very important places and their cultures. So what the Reformation does is that it takes this very rich tapestry, using your analogy, and says, this is all bunk. What we need to do is simplify it, because you only really need one thread to get the job done, which is get the sewing done. And we'll just take this one and we're going to start sewing. And that's what we need to do, because if you don't have one thread, you are a pagan. You are not a Christian. This habit of creating dichotomies of one or the other, I think, is
Aristotelian thinking.
It is, exactly. And because of that, it creates a different kind of dynamic in the world. It's going to create all kinds of other things, of course, and we can then go back and say, is this a process of development and that it was needed, etc. For sure, because ideas only occur, I guess, when they're needed. But it does set up an interesting dynamic, which is going to start creating a different kind of habit of mind, which is what we would call very clear cut and not so much interested in dialectic, in the give and take, the discussion.
Right. We should probably define scholasticism a little bit for people. Scholasticism was the main mode of doing knowledge, you could say, throughout the Middle Ages. It was based on Aristotelian philosophy, and it's essentially an interaction with tradition. It is a dialectic of saying yes or no with the ideas passed down by the church, chiefly Aristotelian notions. And, this is kind of embodied in Abelard as one of these people who wrote this great work, Sic et Non, and it was burned by Bernard of Clairvaux as an affront to the tradition, I think. And this mode had to be thrown aside in order for the Reformation to take place, but it was replaced with another sort of monolithic tradition.
Exactly. And that tradition, that monolithic tradition, as you describe it, is focused on defining itself as and this is the interesting thing and important thing, as the truth. And this habit then becomes entrenched in our minds of looking for truth in a very particular way, i.e., we can only have truth through rationality. And that concept, I think, is both a gift and a curse to the world, because it has created one of the greatest heresies of the Reformation, of Protestantism, and that is Scientism, where there is no truth outside of science. If you can't explain it, it doesn't exist. And this is where Wittgenstein is very important for us as a corrective, and a very brilliant philosopher, Elizabeth Hanscom. But what we then get into is this idea that truth is knowable through this means only. If you don't do it this way, you don't have the truth. You're lying, you're deluded, you're etc.
Yeah, this is the line Bertrand Russell was toting when he was teaching Wittgenstein, which Wittgenstein rejected, and Russell said, well, he's grown tired of serious thinking, so he's found some way to get out of it. And then never the twain shall meet again, because they're starting from different a priori assumptions.
Exactly. And both of these, of course, traditions, the separation, as you put it very well, both of these, this separation creates...
Yeah, I call it the schism.
Schism,
it's
yeah,
the greater schism.
Exactly. And this creates its own two schools or systems of thought and behavior and understanding. But what it does do, of course, and this is something very new in our world, is that it creates, for lack of a better term, belligerence, where dialogue and conversation is shut down because truth only belongs here or there. And if you don't belong here or there, you don't have the truth. Sorry. That habit of mind, I think, like I said, it's one of the heresies of Protestantism. That habit of mind creates a particular kind of society, for lack of a better term, a particular way of interacting with each other that I think has created more problems than it has solved.
Yeah, I mean, it created flat earthers.
Exactly.
Which are huge now. It's this sort of idea, like if you squeeze a bar of soap too tightly, it'll just shoot out of your hand. And that's kind of what science has done with people. Exactly. It's squeezed too tightly. And so you've got all these people who are on wild goose chases now because they're done with science. So science is a failed and government-controlled operation, and the outward bounds of our knowledge are totally defined by government funding. And so what can we know from science? What we know is from our own senses, and my senses tell me the earth is flat. So that's something that is very dangerous, is that, you know, science can be our friend and it can be our enemy, but it shouldn't be either one too much, because it's a method.
Exactly.
It's a tool. It's not a religion.
Exactly. But it's treated as such.
Yes.
This is the problem. And it becomes scientism rather than simply science. Sure, science is important because it's part of the conversation.
Yep.
It's part of our understanding of reality.
Oh, and let it be known, we are both pro-science people.
For sure.
Yeah.
But it's not enough. Science isn't it. There's more to life. It's like Wittgenstein says. You may answer all the scientific questions you may want to answer, but in the end, you still are stuck with life. Yep. And you can't answer it. Can't answer the important questions of life. And this is where we need the other traditions, the esoteric and so forth, that help us understand what we are supposed to do and how we are supposed to live. And unfortunately, these two questions science cannot answer.
Right. Science has very little to say about qualia.
Exactly. So getting back to Protestantism and the discovery of the New World, where we then end up is looking at the world not simply as as a given, as something that we can interact with, that is malleable, that we discussed earlier with the Greek habit of mind. But it projects that malleability, or rather transforms that malleability into, well, for lack of a better term, and I don't want to jump on this too quickly, but into consumability. Because remember, with the Reformation also comes a very profound change in economics, which is the commodification of the world. And this is going to become a very strong philosophical tradition where the world is exploited, used simply for monetary gain.
Right. Just to give people some background, what happens is when the Europeans go to the New World, they find enormous amounts of silver, and they bring a lot of this silver and gold back where it was kind of useless in the New World to the native people there, and they flood the market with New World silver, and this just skyrockets inflation. And it basically, now it's not smart to say that this collapses the Ottoman Empire because it's still around 400 years later, but it definitely takes some life out of their system, and it puts entities like the Holy Roman Empire on firmer footing to combat the Ottoman Empire, or to be a counterpoint. And this was a new conception of the world. Before, it was like, oh, the Turk is raging in the east, and it's only a matter of time until he comes knocking on our door and to take us away, so we better say our Hail Marys and our Fathers, lest we be subsumed by Islam. And New World silver changes this. That's a big part of it. Journeys of the discovery of the New World is a tremendous impetus as well for new scientific discoveries, for new methods of navigation. And this also creates mercantilism, because the beginnings of capitalism are, there is a land far away that has spices that I want. Some people are willing to go get it, but people have to invest money into these ships. So you put some money into your friend who's a captain. He hires a crew. He goes out. He gets 600 times the worth that was put into the trip. And he comes back, and you are now rich. And, well, this creates the whole system of investment. And everything is about betting on the future from here on out. And that was not the case in medieval Europe, where you tilled your field and you paid your dues to your lord, and you swore fealty, and your lord wasn't really investing much either in these giant ventures. So high risk, high reward really radically altered the course of European history.
For sure. And, during this time as well, the banking system comes into being, letters of credit, checks, and paper money, this kind of thing. And when you talk about investments and whatnot, basically money that is slowly being unhinged from metals, from, say, gold and silver and so forth,
right?
Which leads to the economic crashes in Spain and so forth. So yes, all these forces are unleashed because of these particular ideas. And one thing we should correct when we talk about the Reformation is that there is no such thing as the Protestant ethic.
Yes.
This is, Weber's mythology. That's all it is. There's no such thing.
Or at least there wasn't then.
I don't think there ever was, because Weber never read Calvin. So,
okay.
So he couldn't have known what Calvin meant.
I think of people like my father who can't sit still for 2 minutes lest his mortal soul flitter away or something. And I'm like, that's the Protestant work ethic right there. I don't have it, but he does.
I think that's probably due to something else.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But people like to think that there is such a thing, but there really isn't. So it's all in Weber's own head. So just to, a footnote to our discussion, lest people get into that.
Right.
But getting back to our subject, so when we're talking about this process in the 16th century, and of course there's the Dutch as well, the Dutch Golden Age, which is fueled by this kind of economy. there are tulips that are going to be worth millions of dollars. One bulb of tulip, collapses like crazy. And people are thoroughly impoverished and destroyed. But anyway, yes, those forces are unleashed. But those forces are only possible because of a profound change in thinking, but also are possible because of a profound continuity in thinking. And I think this is what we have to keep in mind whenever we're talking about these grand forces of history, as your listeners are concerned with, is that we often get lost in one little projection of an idea, and we lose the focus on the bigger picture. But we shouldn't do that in order to understand what is really going on. So yes, Protestantism does do what it does, but it's also part of this larger, older tradition. It is picking up on the Aristotelian more than the Platonic, for example. It is pegged in with St. Augustine more. It isn't interested in the various other manifestations of thinking, say in the Greek Orthodox tradition and so forth, or I should just say the Orthodox tradition, and so forth, which is profoundly mystical. Hesychasm, which predates yoga, and all this sort of thing. We can get into that some other time, but there's this entire system that this new way of looking at the world is doing. But I think also more importantly, and this is something that is pertinent to our discussion as well in our day and age, is that Protestantism does something a bit more destructive as well, which is that it denies consistently, it denies history. It says, I don't need history. I can look at the Bible, read it myself, and I know what I need to know. Mm-hmm. I don't need the past. I don't need anything that happened way back then. It's all useless to me.
Because I'm always living in the end times.
Or I'm always the knower of everything.
Right.
And I think that is the dangerous force that Protestantism releases. And because it is so profoundly anti-historical, because anytime you get into history, you have to deal with the Catholics, and you don't want to do that because they're no good. You have to just throw the baby out with the bathwater. We don't need history. We have what we have, which is the scripture, and that's history enough. But what that does, of course, is that it creates, last count, there's 35,000 kinds of Protestant denominations. This is what it creates. You read a couple of verses and say, that's what God means. You guys were wrong. This is what it really means. And that, I think, is a dangerous habit of mind. And it is the habit of mind that fuels so many of our current day problems.
I mean, this is what happens when every man and woman is a priest. There is no core doctrine anymore. The concept was sola scriptura, but as our postmodernist friends have taught us, there is an infinite number of ways to analyze a text and to interpret a text. And so when you get to that point, it's like, okay, well, the text can mean anything that I want it to mean, and I see this all the time, especially in I grew up in the church, so something that really annoys me is when you would get people giving you tidbits of the Bible, like piece by piece. They're like, it's bibliomancy, right? They would literally just throw the book open and point and go, that's the verse that's going to instruct me for today. And I'm like, that is madness. You are...
And it's also a very particular kind of magic.
Yeah. Oh, it is. Yeah. They actually had this really cool... I don't know if you've ever seen the Psalter and Key.
The Psalter and the Key,
yeah. So maybe some of the listeners don't know this. You would get two people. They would lock a book with a key in the middle of it. And you would have part of the key sticking out. And you would get two people to hold the key as long as possible before the book slipped from your fingers and fell on the table and popped open. And that was the page that you would use as for your divination. And people did this with Virgil. People did this with the Bible. There's all sorts of various... King James is one of the most esoteric occult texts that there have ever been in terms of reception. I don't know if you've heard... There's a lot of speculation about the King James Bible these days. You know how like a lot of the translation is kind of like they're blunders or it's boulderized a little bit. The theory among the conspiracy theorists today is that CERN and the Hadron Collider are changing space and time and altering the text of the Bible to lead us into damnation. It's called the Mandela effect.
Oh, that's a new one for me.
Yeah, based on... So apparently it was like Nelson Mandela died only like 3 years ago or something. And then a lot of people were like, what? I thought Nelson Mandela died like in the 90s. And so the idea was that like Nelson Mandela did in fact die in the 90s. But since the Hadron Collider has been in operation, it changes the track of our timeline. And so we're getting these constant new timelines where the Bible is changing and Nelson Mandela is dying in different years and stuff. People believe this stuff. There's people listening to the show right now who will get angry that I am like not taking this seriously. You know, that's fine. But getting back to...
Well, this is where we end up. You see, this is where we end up.
It is where we end up, yeah.
When we allow these kinds of forces, for lack of a better term, to take over our minds. And in the ancient world, this was known as you know, possessions, and there was exorcism involved. Well, that still stuff, you know, that stuff still happens today.
Right.
So yes, people do get possessed by certain ideas and it drives them mad, and they need to be sometimes corrected or exorcised,
or they become a class of society that is accepted and rejected, like the Agori.
Exactly.
I don't know if you saw Reza Aslan hanging out with the Agori recently. Did you see that?
I did not see that, no.
Okay, well, so Reza Aslan was just like, oh, everything is great and beautiful and all cultures are lovely and I'm going to go hang out with the Hindus. And so he went to go, quote unquote, hang out with the Hindus, and he wound up like in this Agori circle where they were forced him to eat human body parts and like burnt brains. And then they said like, the guy was just like, if you don't shut the fuck up, I'm going to cut your head off. And so all of a sudden, he's just like, I've made a mistake. If you could distract him while I like get away, because they're all just like eating feces and like drinking their urine and stuff like that. And he's like, this was a bad idea. So that was Reza Aslan's like recent adventure. That was like maybe 2 months ago or something. He was all over the news and he's like, I'm never doing that again. People were having a great day. Like,
I can well imagine.
It's all caught on camera too, which is the best part. And it's funny because there's like the raw footage that I saw, and then there's the CNN edited fake news footage, and it's just like they took out all of the parts where it's like these people are insane. They will kill you. They will cut your head off
and eat it.
Yeah, and there were all sorts of international Hindu organizations who were so mad, and reasonably so. It'd be like going to some, I don't know, hair shirt flagellant and being like, this is a Christian, your average Christian. He beats himself every day and he cuts himself for Jesus, and this is what Christianity's all about. So, Reza Aslan, congratulations.
Right. Well, these are the aberrations of thought. This is what we end up with. This is the madness that we're part of. And I think this is where we as a modern culture in this day and age have to be very careful when we're talking about the importance of ideas. Because all too often we don't know what we mean by ideas. By ideas, to be very clear, we're talking about tradition. You cannot come up with ideas with an empty head. It doesn't work. It doesn't happen. All you have are feelings. And those are not ideas. Ideas mean tradition, and if we are not going to be talking about tradition, we're not going to be talking about ideas.
This is hard though, because it's tough. Because you get somebody like I've thought of this before. There's nothing new under the sun. Well, something that's often put in the face of this is like, okay, well, what about the camera? There was no ideas that like went into the camera. It didn't exist, and then it existed. There were paintings or like...
No, this is when we're talking about cameras, we're talking about the extension of sight. We're talking about a very ancient idea of capturing and understanding reality through representation.
Right.
So, no, camera is not a new idea. Okay. Yes, technology, for sure. Technology is technology. It comes and goes and changes and evolves. But the idea behind the technology, why it must do this, why must a camera take a picture, why must camera not make a pizza, is something very, very particular. And therefore, it is an idea that is now made to function.
Right.
So it is the seeing eye that looks into reality and says, I will capture that because that if I capture it, it has significance. We're in the world of ideas immediately. Of course, this is what this is all about. I mean, what in Turkey, that very famous discovery of Göbekli Tepe.
Yes.
The earliest, representations of things, of animals and whatnot, birds. That's camera. That's, the camera at work. This is that ability of the human eye to see things, the mind to record, and then to give meaning to.
Right.
And that's what this is. So, sure, the technology has changed, and it's more convenient and so forth. And sadly, it requires less discipline because it requires less tradition and teaching and et cetera, but it does what it does. Mm-hmm. So, I would suggest that, no, I think there are certain ideas that keep repeating themselves. Yes, technology changes, but it captures or behaves according to those old ideas.
Right, and it's in accordance with the concepts of optics that were developed and so forth.
Exactly.
So you mentioned in an email to me something about the physics of light, and you were saying speculative grammar and conceptions of the soul. So maybe if you wanted to say a few things about those things.
Sure. This is getting us back into the Middle Ages again. And what I was suggesting with those three concepts, especially the concepts of the soul, because the two other notions, lead into that. When we're talking about the soul in the medieval time period, and perhaps I'm sure still today, because these ideas are, of course, still important, especially what is the soul. What we're talking about is this idea that human beings have a certain kind of existence, and this is the obvious point first. That existence is, of course, more physical and then non-physical, whatever that would be, but that would be the soul. But this idea that the soul can have certain kinds of knowable properties, and because it has certain kinds of knowable properties, it can then delve into areas, spheres outside of itself, and thereby bring certain kinds of influences. Now I'm using Renaissance vocabulary.
Sympathetic magic.
Exactly. This good old Ficino. It can bring these kinds of influences into material reality. And by bringing those influences into reality, it can affect change for the better. And this is the important thing, that whenever we're talking about, for lack of a better term, whenever we're talking about soul technology, we're always talking about a technology that brings betterment, goodness into the world. That is the influence of the soul as such. It's always for the best, for the better, to bring about the good. So in the medieval world, and this is something that, of course, often gets, I think this is the problem with the medieval world, just, taking a step back. People often misunderstand it and therefore misrepresent it as an age of superstition and whatnot, darkness and witch burnings and whatnot, and
which is funny because the majority of witch burnings happened during the early modern period.
It's a Protestant problem. Yeah. And all of that. So what we have to do is really excise these images out of our mind when we're talking about the Middle Ages and really talk about a rather profound age that looked at reality, confronted reality in very profound ways. And one of these is, I like to refer to it as soul technology. And this doesn't mean, as you mentioned earlier, flagellants and whatnot.
But that's what I mean when I say soul technology. I'm talking about shamanic techniques.
Yes. And I think this is where we need to, this is what these texts, these medieval texts point us to, is that there are certain kinds of traditions, there are certain kinds of practices, disciplines that need to be done, which better not simply the personals, the personal, but also the world around the personal. So certain kinds of forces are unleashed, and these forces are, of course, forces of order that bring benefit to those around us and to the world at large. And this concern then with using this technology, this understanding, this wisdom, they would call it, in this way, brings about an alignment with something grander and bigger than us. This is, again, taking us back to those, first threads of our conversation that we were talking about, this realignment of the self with something greater. So the soul then is the channel, is the conduit through which this aggrandizement comes about, this greater than myself. How can I conceive myself as being greater than myself? Well, because I have a soul, which is greater. Why is it greater? Because it's eternal.
Yeah. This
is the kind of explanation that we encounter in these traditions.
Right. Picatrix sort of talks about this in a way, in the sense that because we have sense impressions from the senses, and then we have the common sense, which is the nexus of all the senses, and that's sort of where the soul, or the eye of the soul, occurs. And I would call this the imagination, probably, to make it not as nebulous of a concept to understand, but it's the imagination that can create pictures of a better world and then put them into effect. And so, but without the imagination, without the simulation of the mind, nothing gets better. And I think this is probably where consciousness emerged to begin with, as a simulator for risky ideas. And so it was like, I can create a simulacrum of myself in my mind's eye that can do the thing that I want it to do. And if it dies, then I won't do that thing. And so this is kind of like mini out-of-body experience at every given moment, where you are extrapolating out of your immediate circumstances and envisioning a future. And this is probably where cognition began. And who knows what it was brought about, increase in fat diet, or the correct enzymes from cooking meat, or psilocybin mushrooms on the plains of Africa. I don't know. There's a million different theories. So I've heard one is the throwing arm. So you have to, when you throw something to kill something, you have to project yourself into the future by a few frames, because you're throwing at a moving target. The target is going through space, so you have to anticipate where the target will be in the future. And there's something about that process that created our ability to look into the future, and maybe it got exacerbated by more protein in the diet, or who knows, or maybe there's some sort of invisible hand of God pulling on it, and that is why we have the brains that we have. But the imagination, the soul, I think that these are critical to even like the scientific revolution and things like that. It's just, it becomes a demon when you become obsessed with the simulacra and not with the actual reality itself. And that's what I would call the myth of progress, or that sort of endless march toward progress where you shed your humanity in the process into, I don't know, transhumanism or post-humanism or whatever they want to call it. That should be around the corner, but assuming there's no collapse. But that's always the big debate. Do we have enough energy to make the transition into the next step, if there is a next step?
I think there isn't a next step if we mean...
I don't either.
Yeah.
I think where we came from is where we're going.
Where we're going. I think back to Herodotus' cycles.
Yeah.
That's where we're going. We're going back to tradition and back to where we came from, as you said. And all these other things of transhumanism and
it's a pipe dream.
Robots and whatnot. It's a pipe dream.
Yeah, it's a very narrow group of Silicon Valley elites who have, they've managed to realize all of their wildest dreams, and so they think that the ceiling is just infinite.
Or perhaps you're scared of death. It's very simple.
Right.
Once you achieve everything and you have billions of dollars, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
You're going to worry about, oh no, I'm going to die now. So yeah, it's a confrontation with our own mortality, and we're trying to transcend it by a computer or something that will help us beyond. Because notice what's absent is an understanding or dialogue with the soul. If we cannot understand ourselves beyond our physical, then we're going to have these problems, and we're going to look for solutions. So transhumanism, well, here's my soul, the computer. It's going to make me immortal. So there we go. Yeah. I've got my immortality worked out now. I've taken care of my soul. But the process is the same. It's your camera analogy. It's the same sort of thing. Yeah, the soul now will inhabit is now the computer or something that will take me beyond death. But the concern is the same. What am I going to do when I die? What's going to happen? What is going to take place? Where will I end up? What's going to, what is it? What's it all about? So yes, but I think the truer answers for us as humanity, as human beings, are in the tradition. We need to go back and recover that. We've lost so much. We need to go back and recover these traditions and this wisdom, for lack of a better term, this wisdom, this great wisdom we've lost. And unfortunately, this has lessened our humanity. It hasn't, made it greater. It's lessened our humanity because we've lost an understanding, a profound understanding of who and what we are or were.
Right.
And we cannot get beyond. We cannot progress in a proper manner if we don't have that understanding. It's we're trying to run when we don't have legs. Right. That's what's going on. It's yes, we can use technology to make us run, etc., etc. But it's not that. It's not what we all want to do.
So now this might I might anticipate how you're going to answer this question based on the paper that you read some time ago at the symposium in Guelph. But now, in the wake of 20th century anthropology, in the wake of 19th century, Fraser and these guys, Malinowski, in the wake of cultural relativism, in the wake of Marx and cultural Marxism, what tradition is worth saving and what tradition is not worth saving, and how do we know? And what, which traditions are valuable? And so this is a serious question, because lately we have various political movements, especially things like the alt-right, where we have a revival of nationalism. But even among the alt-right, you can't get three people to agree. Is it ethno-nationalism we're after? Is it civic nationalism we're after? Is this about genes? Is this about ideas? Is this about which ideas are better? Are the ideas that are better, is it just because they came from people with superior genes? You know what I mean? It's like these, I call them the logogram and the biogram. And these interpenetrate each other, but there's always the right tries to deny the logogram, the emotions, the feelings, the culture in favor for biology, and the left ignores biology in favor of emotions, and so and I mean, obviously, to me, the answer is to be in the center and to see these two forces operating. But how do we determine what cultures are better, if we can use that word?
I think we should use
better or more apt. I don't know.
I think we should use those terms, which is better and which is not. Harsh as that may sound,
right?
It's important, because this is thinking. This is true thinking. And what is true thinking? The ability to discern.
Right.
If we give up the ability to discern, we become animals. We don't become humans. We are no longer humans, I should say. Humanity has only grown when it has discerned. So, getting back to the confusion of our times, as you very well described it, I would suggest a simpler approach, which is, let's get rid of all of these and let's keep the tradition. These are aberrations. This, postmodernism and its, marriage with Marxism, Maoism, etc. These are fads, for lack of a better term, dangerous fads for sure. Not something that we should, of course, promote or vaunt or identify with, because really this is mindlessness,
right,
in its ultimate form. So
I think it was Lacan who called Derrida a terrorist.
A lot of people call him that. Well, he's an improper Heideggerian. Now, let's put it that way. Why I say improper is because he takes Heidegger and he tries to marry Heidegger, I should say, with Marx, and it's not a good mix. And Heidegger, of course, has his own problems, Nazism being one of them. So we have to be very careful. But again, to be very fair to be fair and objective, Heidegger is coming out of the pre-Socratic tradition, so it's not something just dreamt out in left field or something. He has a very strong historical tradition that he's coming from, and it's the ancient struggle between the pre-Socratic and the Socratic, which gives better results, and history has shown Socratic.
And I would say that the cultural climate would culminate with Kant and German idealism, in that idealism wins out and becomes the object of debate. And that's sort of the springboard from which these things have to emerge, is in conflict with German idealism.
Right. And this is the context, I guess, that Heidegger and Derrida are coming. They're in a way reacting against this sort of thing. And of course, Nietzsche is part of this mix as well. But I think Nietzsche, unfortunately, as with Nietzsche often, he gets misused and misrepresented by, all and sundry. But that's, something else. But getting back to your question, which is basically the very famous question asked by Chernyshevsky: what are we supposed to do? What are we to do? What are we going to do? I think the answer lies in choosing the path of sanity, which is those ideas that have historically shown us to give us the best results. This is not, simply saying, that we're going to be utilitarian or something like that. But no, we're talking about human life. We're talking about living. And when we start doing that, we have to be able to discern. We don't go around in life doing whatever we want to do. Right. There are rules and regulations we have to obey. I can't just go and cross the street whenever I feel like it.
Yeah, that is the chief argument leveled against the postmodernists.
Exactly.
It's like, okay, everything is arbitrary and hinges in space selflessly, but you don't live your life that way.
Exactly. It's something we have to be aware of, that in the end, how am I going to live my life? And the other problem with Derrida and company is that, are we happy with nihilism? This is where we end up. Are we going to be content by being good nihilists?
Right. Well, I mean, this is why Nietzsche laments that God is dead, and it's a lamentation.
Exactly, but I think the God he's lamenting, and this is where we have to be careful with Nietzsche, I think. The God he is lamenting is the God of the philosophers. And even he's ambivalent, Nietzsche, even he is ambivalent about whether that God of the philosophers, by which I mean God as idea, prime mover and all that sort of thing, whether the God of the philosophers is the same as the God of revelation.
Right.
The two are not the same.
Not to Blaise Pascal. His conversion story, his diary has his, like, the date that he converts, and it's a very clear moment in space and time, and he says, Le Dieu d'Abraham, pas le Dieu des philosophes. And that's it. That's all he wrote. Just
and I think
God of Abraham, not of the philosophers.
Exactly, and I think he was following, or he was actually following after, because he comes after, a very famous conversion in that regard. Well, not really conversion, but that affirmation, which is Thomas Aquinas.
Right, and St. Augustine before him.
Exactly.
Or Boethius.
Yes,
Boethius. Well, Boethius is like
the
he's other
tricky,
way.
But he's going the other way. But he does the same sort of thing.
Yeah.
Which is that, there's something mysterious about this whole thing. Rationality can only go that far, and then it stops, and then mystery takes over.
Right.
And we, as modern human beings, have abandoned mystery and laughed at it and say it's no good, etc., etc. It's magic and it's supernaturalism and whatnot. And but no, it's something there. There's some importance in saying I don't know. And I think the minute we start saying I don't know to some things that we can't explain and don't know, and are therefore saying that there are certain things that are unknowable,
right,
in the material.
And this is the position, I mean, it's formally called New Mysterianism is the name for it. And I would ascribe myself to that position, but I also recognize that it's sort of like a glorified philosophical God in the gaps theory.
I think
where it's like as we push the boundaries of our understanding, the God in the gaps shrinks and shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. But I don't really see it that way. I think of it as like the more you build the fire, the brighter the dark, like the more darkness.
I think this is, Dawkins gets into this a lot. That's his bread and butter, this God of the gaps business. But I think what we have to be really careful with that kind of explanation, and of course, as we've discussed before, Dawkins is no philosopher, though he likes to delve into philosophy. I don't know why, but he does. And once he starts applying cause and effect arguments to mystery, which is what he's trying to do in this God of the gaps business. And, once he starts doing this, what he ends up doing is looking at ideas, looking at explanations, I should say, not ideas, looking at explanations that are in themselves, filling in the gaps. Because what is scientific knowledge? It is always haphazard. It isn't complete. No scientist will say, I've got the final
I don't even
answer.
like the term gap. Yeah, because it assumes that there's like a complete picture that needs to be filled out.
It's a puzzle and one piece is missing. Exactly.
A puzzle that has no borders.
Yes. Or there is no puzzle.
Yeah.
And what we have is simply life and existence.
Yeah, the problem is you think there's a problem.
Yes,
it's part of enlightenment is getting away with that.
I think Dawkins and company are limited in their arguments, are limited by their arguments, because they fall into this trap of explanation. And there are certain things that cannot and perhaps should not be explained.
Right. Not everything can be reified.
Exactly. And by doing this, what we are then doing is diminishing life. We are saying life has no room for mystery, has no room for encounter with mysteries, because then that is a diminishing of life.
Right.
Then we walk into
the gulag,
or robot, or exactly the gulag or the robot. Then we become robots.
I think they are two sides of the same coin. If you're not the robot, you're in the gulag.
You're in the gulag. Exactly. And this is where I think we have to be very careful with, and this is where we have to be very concerned with postmodernism and how it has unfortunately now fully inhabited universities. Because where universities have ended up, I think, to their detriment. It's the old story of the Trojan horse. They dragged in the Trojan horse, and now the Greeks are out. So what we have to be very careful with postmodernism in universities is that there is this culture now that says this is the way to think, And if you do not think this way, you don't think. That, I think, is the problem with postmodernity, in that it says there is no thinking.
It's thinking with a hammer.
Yes. And yes. And once that starts happening, we are simply in the first or maybe the middle steps of tyranny. And it ain't going to be pretty when that happens.
And this is something I've been trying to stress throughout the course of the Encyclopedia Hermetica series, is that freedom is not a universal value. There was no word for it in ancient Egypt. This is something that has to be coaxed out of reality and then applied. It's not just something that, it's not a glittering generality that you can just wave out your window. You have to actually fight for it. You have to live it.
And you have to create it.
Yes.
It's not a given. It doesn't grow on trees. You have to create it. And how do you create it? With good ideas. And that gets us back to having discernment. We have to get back to saying this is better than that. If we don't say this is better than that, then nothing is better than anything.
Yeah, there's nothing to learn.
There's nothing. And that's nihilism.
Which is funny that the university should be possessed by that spirit, because if you can't learn it, if there's nothing to learn, why am I paying to go to university?
I think...
It's a sophist thing too, right? Like, why do you sign up to work for under a sophist when there's nothing to learn?
Exactly. But I think that is what we have to, as a society. Here's another way of looking at it. These institutions like universities and the higher education, or education in itself, the education system...
It starts in the high schools, for sure.
For sure. Let's look at it as a system then. Say the education system, and not just pick on universities for it. The education system. All institutions like this exist in society through the goodwill of human beings, of people. So the question to ask, is the goodwill disappearing for these educational system in people? And if it is, why? Well, if it is doing, let's try to answer that question. If it is disappearing, then the why has to be that it is not providing what people want it to provide. Unfortunately, they muddy the water by saying, we're training you to get a job. By going to university, by educating yourself, I should say, you're going to end up in a higher category of employment.
You'll be a scribe instead of a serf.
Yes, exactly. Well, that doesn't happen in the real world.
Yep, I'm both a scribe and a serf.
Unfortunately, these institutions hand out degrees, pieces of paper, that have no value in society anymore. Whose fault is that? Whose fault is that? It's the universities. It's the institution's fault. They have chosen to create certain kinds of ideas they think are important to have within the context of the institution, but are meaningless and valueless in society.
Definitely.
So yes, you go to university, let's just use that example, and you end up being a solid postmodernist. Derrida inside out, Lacan.
Foucault,
you can argue anyone out of your chair any time, under the table, etc. But society doesn't value that anymore.
That's why a lot of people aren't hiring university students, because they don't want social justice warriors messing up their workplace.
Because what it is creating, this is the problem with postmodernism, is that it doesn't educate, it conditions and indoctrinates. It isn't education that you end up getting, it's understanding how to assume a political posture. That's what you do. You become a poser, for lack of better
Literally.
term. You know the right words. You know how to react when those words are spoken. You're triggered by certain things. You say the right things all the time. You keep repeating them. There's no point in getting into all those things that are repeated. And that is passed off, or I should say palmed off, as thought, as thinking. Well, it isn't. And this is the problem we are having. So
it's like neo-scholasticism almost.
even that would be some kind of thinking. This
citation or it didn't happen, that
Yes.
sort of thinking. Yeah.
So you end up with behavior management strategies. That's what you end up with. And that is not what these universities were meant to do. This is why they're doing such a bad job, and they create these graduates who are worthless, as you call them, social justice warriors, because that's all they know. This is thinking.
Right.
For them, this is the highest form of thought.
They know how to dismantle. And
Yes.
I mean, I'm very well trained, let's say, in dismantling. I can dismantle everything, but it
Yes.
doesn't...
Do anything.
Okay, I'm left with a room with nothing.
Yes.
And it's like, I'm in a giant ohm hole.
Exactly. And that is not life. You cannot go around destroying. I mean, Derrida has a nicer word for it. He calls it deconstruction. Heidegger was more blunt and honest. He called it destruction.
Yeah, so did Nietzsche. That
Exactly.
thinking with a hammer is a Nietzsche
Is
line,
destruction, exactly. So we're really talking about destructionists, people who know how to destroy. But that's not how you build cultures. This is not how you build a life. This is not how you build civilizations or society. Society needs builders. And those builders can be with a hammer and nail and machinery, but it's also with the mind. Because society needs good ideas. So if you take away the good ideas from society, as these institutions are doing, you do end up with nothing. And so people recognize that. Hence the goodwill is disappearing. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is something that the universities and the education system in itself will have to deal with, because that is the next war that's coming our way, is, do we need universities? Do we need degrees?
Right.
Do we need education?
Mm-hmm.
Because this isn't education.
Right.
It's conditioning to be destructive. So do we need destroyers that are trained to destroy and then move on? Or do we need something else as human beings, for in society, the human beings we need in society?
Yeah.
That's a question we have to answer as a society.
And the future is so... it's the future, so it is by definition uncertain. But in terms of which direction we will go, will there be some kind of collapse of the intellectual system, and then a kind of like rebirth? Will that rebirth be one based out of superstition? Will there be some sort of apocalyptic culture war? That's what ideas will come out on top. It's hard to say, because we've leveled the playing field. There's nothing left. Everything's been destroyed, and so it's like, what will come in to fill the vacuum? And obviously Islam is one of these things that is rapidly filling up that vacuum, here in Canada, also in Europe, because people don't have any structure. And Islam is an extremely strong and rigid structure. So it's very attractive to a lot of people who see the West as a force of nihilism and decay. And so they think, oh, well, I don't want that, so I want Sharia or whatever. And that's only one of many schools of thought that could emerge out of it. So who knows what the future holds in terms of what the intellectual landscape will look like in 40 years.
I agree, but I think we should keep the older structure in mind, which is the Dark Age, which leads to the Renaissance. That, I think, is what we need to build towards. And this has to be on an individual level first. So yes, you are right. Why is, for example, Islam so successful in the West right now? Well, because the West is nihilistic. And that means nothing. So nothingness, something is always greater than nothingness. So this is why, it is successful, and this is why it is doing what it does. But I don't, in the end, I think I'm an optimist.
Yes.
Yes, there is much to lament about and be pessimistic about, and there's destruction and so forth. But I also think, and I think this is something we as an entire society or as culture have to be concerned with, is that there are certain ideas that need to be kept and preserved, which will then guarantee the Renaissance. And the chief idea, the most important idea, is this one of humanism. this idea that says that we must always project outwards from our own selves. That is where our strength lies as a Western culture, but also it's the place from which the new Renaissance will arise. So yes, we are right now in the grim world of destruction. We have let the Vandals in their various disguises and forms. And as individuals, there's only certain things we can do and cannot do. But there's one thing we can do as individuals, and that is not abandon ideas that are essential. Essential, I say, because those ideas which historically have yielded the best civilization. That is where our, I think, hope lies. If we abandon those ideas, then there's no hope. But there are, I think, enough good people in society who understand this and who are doing this.
I hear, and it's hopeful in some ways. I'm kind of ambivalent about it because I see great potential and great risk in it. But I hear the terms bandied about very often these days, metacultural war. And what it is a sort of Western jihad in the greater jihad sense of the term, not lesser jihad. And that is plant trees, plant gardens, eat locally, learn your Bach. It's all about combating degeneracy in their words. So I'm ambivalent about it because I see in it kind of the seeds of this sort of National Socialist revival, pagan thinking of like we need to restore the traditions of our ancestors because that's the only way out. And I agree to some extent. It's just that we tried that less than 100 years ago, and it was a catastrophe. But I think the difference between the way it was done in the 1930s in Germany was that it was a top-down thing, whereas this, they call it a metacultural war because the idea is you do it on your own by yourself and you develop yourself. And then the idea is you get enough people who are shedding irony. Irony is the great poison of our age, at least for my generation. Everything is ironic. Nothing is serious anymore. There's no poignancy to doing anything. You're an Olympic athlete, whatever. Like, the sun's going to explode. Who cares? You're a scholar, whatever. Your books are going to wither into dust and nothingness. And so let's just be hip and whatever and watch the world burn and not really care. And so that's giving in to what these culture warriors call degeneracy. And it's just, you don't stand up for yourself. You don't stand up for your family. You don't stand up for your people. You don't stand up. And again, I see an ambivalence in that. I say, you don't stand up for your people. What does that mean? Well, I also hear people say, our women. Well, it's okay when like an Indian chief says like, oh, I'm looking out for my people. But when a white person says like, oh, I'm looking out for our women, it's like the end of the world. It's like, what? You don't own other people, other women. You don't own other people, blah, blah, blah. And I agree with that. And that's why it's kind of a lead by example. And that's what the metacultural war is all about. It's a greater jihad for humanism instead of Islam. And that's literally what it is. And it's in competition with Post-Modernism, in competition with Islam, in competition with Scientism, in competition with all of these different forces. And I think that the reason that I'm ambivalent about it is because the future is uncertain. It's like, I don't know if that is the right way out or if it's back toward another 1930s. So I'm cautious about people who use these terms, but I see that there is an inkling of hope in that regard, that people are willing to take the situation into their own hands, and instead of giving into despair and saying, oh, well, woe is me, I'm just one tiny little individual, what can I do? It's like, well, you can actually do quite a lot. And you can influence other people to do a lot. And then you can be the butterfly effect that changes the course of history. It's just that it has to occur on an individual level, as opposed to this masochistic, suicidal thinking, self-abnegation, and these sort of things. Humanism is the way out, I guess.
Yes, and I think, and your caution is I think well put, and that's important to keep in mind, is that we don't want to go down the end of the Weimar and the emergence of Herr Hitler mode. But I think what we also have to be aware of, and I agree with this whole with your understanding of where this metacultural war takes us and leads us. But I think the problem with all of these kinds of solutions is that they always locate themselves in selfish expressions. Mm-hmm. You need to do this. You go off and do this. But I don't think the tradition teaches us that. When we're talking about the Renaissance, it is about participation in the world of ideas that others as well have. So, by which we mean, if you've never read Homer before, go off and read Homer.
Oh, that's a huge part of the greater jihad of the metacultural war.
And but what we need to do then, and this is where we have to get out of that mode, once you've read Homer and all that sort of thing, is that you have to then say that there are certain ideas which take me outside of myself, which take me outside of my individual effort, which then build society. So, after you've read your Homer, you have to then say, so what? You have to say, what do I do now? It takes us back to those two questions we began with. What am I supposed to do? And what am I going to do with this sort of thing? Once I start looking at what I'm supposed to do with my knowledge, with my ideas, now that I've got them, this takes us outside of ourselves, and this takes us into society. This was the strength of the Athenians, who are the first experimenters of humanism and this and that. And
right. When we say Renaissance, we're saying the Renaissance of their ideas.
Yes, exactly. The Greeks and, the classical complex, that whole, hive of arguments and ideas.
It's perhaps a bit of an epistemological cartoon to break it down into these two categories, but I've done so on the series, is that what essentially we're talking about Nietzschean master morality.
Okay. Yes.
Is the resumption or the saying that there isn't anything bad about master morality. I mean, until there is, of course, but there's a lot of slave morality in the world and very little master morality, and there has to be a healthy balance between the two.
For sure. And this is Platonic. This is something that, but what we're getting at, and this is important, and this is something that Nietzsche and, going back to Plato and Aristotle, they don't abandon. The point is that what we're looking at is the strengthening or the reemergence of the nation state. So all of these symptoms that we're pointing to, nationalism, the alt-right, and so forth, in a way are not really 1930s Germany, because they are really relying on another set of ideas that were not being used by Hitler and company. Because to be very, strict about it in our discussion, Hitler and company are based upon one man's notion of the world.
Well, yeah, and it was science and theosophy. The spiritual dimension was brought about by Helena Blavatsky in 1888, and the scientific dimension was brought about by Darwin.
And Savitri Devi's very famous, what was it, the sun? I can't remember the sun mythology. I can't remember the title of the book. But yes, all of that. So it's a very particular instance, hence the tyranny, hence the cruelty, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But I think when we're talking about nationalism and patriotism and populism today, these are terms that people get nervous about because their only reference, unfortunately, is
Hitler.
And this is the poverty of our age. We cannot think beyond immediate examples we've been force-fed.
Hence the problem with the left is that everybody is a Nazi.
Exactly.
And so you punch a Nazi, you go punch everybody who isn't you.
Yes, exactly. And there's a failure to understand that we're talking about a different collection of ideas here than there. So when we're talking about nationalism, not populism, and patriotism, we're really talking about the reemergence of the nation state. We're really talking about Enlightenment ideas. That's when they come about. This is Voltaire. This is Rousseau. This is where this is all located. Has nothing to do with Hitler. So we have to be very clear about this distinction. So for me, I see nationalism, populism, and patriotism as rather positive steps towards the reemergence of a stronger nation state. That's why we need to. That's what we need to focus on. Why I say nation state is because, getting back to using Renan, Renan's definition of what a nation is. We need to understand that notion, which basically he said that a nation is the soul of a people. And this has nothing to do with race. This has nothing to do with genes and DNA and whatnot, because a soul belongs to everybody if you want to be part of it. Ideas belong to everyone if you want to be part of them. Mm-hmm. And that, I think, is the essential difference here, which we often neglect or ignore or perhaps are unaware of. So these, I think, are very positive steps towards the Renaissance we're talking about. The Renaissance will come because the nation state, I think, will emerge.
Right. I mean, globalism has nowhere to go but collapse.
Exactly. It's a failed system because what it does is that it empowers an elite, which no one wants, because you and I cannot be members of that elite, and hence we're always third-class citizens in wherever status we are put into. But with the nation state, what happens is that you have the emergence of prosperity. Suddenly, wealth, not simply dollars, but also ideas, is available to everybody. You can be part of this wealth. I can be part of this wealth. I just have to work at it, and it's there for me. It's not because, I'm left out because of genes or DNA or birth or whatever. It's there. It's available. And only the nation state provides that opportunity to me. And I think this is where the Renaissance is going to happen. This is the new Renaissance. Remember, the Renaissance did always happen in city-states, right? Mm-hmm. It was Florence and so forth. That did this, Milan or whatever. That's where this happened. So the political structure will need to change. We do need to get away from left and right and all this nonsense.
Yeah. And I mean, it will happen whether we want it to or not, because we are in a sort of thermodynamic energy bubble that has to burst at some point. And when that bursts, widespread travel, airplanes, shipping food, all of these things, they will all collapse. And that localism will have no choice but to start up again. And I think that might be the reemergence of something like the city-state.
Exactly. I think that's exactly where we're headed. And I think that is a positive thing. Mm-hmm. Yes, the destruction is never good, but we're in a bad way as far as civilization goes. We're not a good civilization anymore. We've become a very destructive and a self-destructive civilization in a lot of ways. And so we've basically lived out the cycle here. It's time for a new cycle to come about. And perhaps, these other forces that have been unleashed upon us, like Islam, and perhaps are part of that destructive element. To take another
counterpoint.
Yes, these are the elements that will destroy us. But then from that destruction, Phoenix-like, we will emerge. And So I'm optimistic we will emerge into a renaissance, because our habit of mind, despite it being sullied, has not been destroyed.
And nature abhors a vacuum.
Exactly. Exactly.
So if you fill your head with a whole bunch of nothing, there's nowhere else to go but to fill
But
it
to
back
something.
up. Yeah. And it was good, said the Lord.
It was good. And it is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think that probably covers our topic. We've been talking for 2 hours and a half now.
Wow.
Do you have anything that you want to say? Maybe you would like to talk about your magazine.
Oh, the Postal, yes.
Yeah, please do.
Very quickly, I won't, keep...
No, I mean, I have all the time in the world, so I'm just trying to stay within the time for you.
Yes, the Postal magazine is something new I started. I think you had a look at it.
Yeah.
So I would encourage people to have a look, and I think you'll leave a link.
Yeah, there's a link in the description below the video.
Great. Yes, and basically what I want to do is what we've been talking about, which is to help build the new Renaissance, to bring back those ideas, those traditions that are important in building civilization, starting with some basic things and then building upwards from that. So I would encourage people to have a look and see, what they find there. I think they will find something of interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've read a couple of articles in there. There were some pretty good ones. I read one on libertarianism in there, and there was a co-equivocation I found in there that I really liked. And I talk a lot about the will on this show because I'm very influenced by Aleister Crowley, who is a very, I would say, complex theoretician of the will.
Oh.
And in this article on libertarianism, there was the co-equivocation between morality and the will.
Right.
And that these are actually like one and the same thing.
Right.
And it's like, I've never really thought of it that way. Like, my will is like what I want the world to be. And that is literally, my moral compass is adjusted in accordance with how I want the world to be. And so it was interesting to see these co-equivocated. And lots of good articles on there. You said Jordan Peterson might be submitting.
He might be submitting. Yes, he said he would. So let's see. I hope. I hope he's not too busy.
That would be nice. I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of people who listen to this series who are big fans of his work and the stuff that he's doing in Toronto today. What else? You have written some books. You are a translator.
Yes. I'm working on one now. It's an edition, a Latin edition of the Encomium of Emma, Queen Emma, medieval text. Queen Emma, for those that may not know, was the wife of King Canute and the mother of Edward the Confessor, of Bayeux tapestry fame. So she commissioned an unknown anonymous monk to write the history of her family. She was a Norman, and so it's a new edition of that and a translation.
Excellent. And has there been an edition for it before, or are you the first?
There was an older edition of it in 1945, 46, I think.
So it's due for an update.
Yes, it needs a new update, especially the translation.
Right.
Yeah.
And you have other translations, something about Vikings?
Yes, I have another edition translation of a description of a Viking attack in 886 AD on Paris, written by a person who saw it, Abbo, who was a monk, and he was in the Abbey of Saint Germain, and he wrote the manuscript, and it just stayed there. It didn't go anywhere. It didn't become a world bestseller or anything like that.
That event is grown in popular consciousness very recently, thanks to the show Vikings.
Oh, I didn't know that.
It's all right. It's fun. I like the show. I mean, I don't watch much TV, but when there's a good miniseries that's like history based, I'll check it out.
Sure.
And they have the whole attack on Paris, and it's very well done. And so I thought of you when I saw it. And so if you can, check out some of Nirmal's books. Check out The Postal, and I'll put all the links in the description below. And hopefully we can get you back and have you chatting up a storm as many times as possible.
Thank you so much, Dan, for this opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Well, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.